This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And yeah, we were being asked some questions about whether Australia has a Thanksgiving. And they have a harvest festival in churches and the like, and the vegetables and flowers and palms and things that come to celebrate are donated to various causes. So, but it's not as big a deal as here. And Dave, I think you were saying something about the Canadians have something similar.
And you know, I've asked the same question of them. It's like, it's not the same date as ours. Why not? Why would you be so close to the United States and yours it has to be on a different day? It could partly just because the harvest has to come in sooner if you live that far north. I have no idea. I don't know. But since you were here and somebody said Happy Thanksgiving and you said, is it tomorrow? I thought, yeah, let's find out. What do they do? What are the principal crops in Australia? And where do they grow?
The arable area is around the coast, on the east coast mainly, a little bit on the west coast. And so if you're up towards Queensland, it's sugarcane and bananas and pineapples. As you come down the coast and you're getting colder towards the southern hemisphere, you're getting mixed agriculture, dairying, hogs, the secondary level ground, which is sedimentary soils that aren't very good. That would be beef cattle grazing, but on the alluvial floodplains, which are drawing from the plate tectonics and a little bit of volcanism, then that's more rich, and that's usually along the rivers for dairying, corn, and crops that you would use for pasture, hay, and sometimes cash crops like potatoes or peas. But mostly the milk is separated to cream, and the cream is sent to a butter factory, and that butter is used locally or it's sent overseas, mainly to the mother country, which is England.
What sort of land got turned into wine country? I know wine has been a big thing for some time now.
Yes, wine, and it's mainly on the slopes and in areas where the soils are suitable. The soils have a lot of effect on the taste of the wine that comes out. So around Orange, west of Sydney by about 200 miles, there's vineyards in Singleton, Newcastle area. On the slopes, they're vineyards. And they're much more popular than they were, and some of that wine is coming here. So today we're dealing with sustainability, but first let's say thank you for a new president. He's Timothy Killeen, and he's coming from the State University of New York, SUNY, where he's been in charge of research, and he's probably on the side of hard science, coming from a physics background, a National Science Foundation background, and he'll be appointed probably in January. Other people we meet, it's interesting that people come back to town. John Zilberg was at the farmers market, and he's an anthropologist, but he lives and works in Indonesia. So that was interesting. We had a fine discussion. Indonesia is fairly close to New Guinea, and half of the eastern half of New Guinea is a protectorate from Australia, but it's almost totally independent now. But sometimes Indonesia, which takes the other half, would like to extend across the whole of New Guinea. So there are interactions there, and there are always people who are wanting to go from Indonesia through to the northern parts of Australia and settle in Australia, and that is a matter of consternation for the Australians. They have the same sort of immigration problems that the US faces on the southern border. Also talked to Jim DeHaven. It's interesting that people are really seriously interested in what you do, and they're environmentalists themselves, and they will accost you occasionally and encourage you to continue doing things. I had a message from Glasgow, Scotland. Brian Cook had read the New York Times, and so we ended up with a sustainability solution for the Corn Belt by a guy named Mark Bittman. And that article parallels a lot of our thinking, that it's kind of sad that you used to have, he was talking about Iowa being 85% prairie, and now it's 85% corn and soybeans. And most of that corn and soybeans, or a lot of it, goes directly or indirectly into our diet, which means that your diet is very restricted. It's almost a one-crop diet or two-crop diet. And so he was speaking about the opportunity to have strips of back country that would be in prairie. He pointed out that a lot of the extended planting of corn and soybeans has been extended into plots of ground that are not easy to work, and if you put an economic cost on them, you're actually costing yourself to plant those sites. So some of the things that he pointed out was destruction of land and water, the marginal agriculture, and some of the present practices he thinks could be modified. And the present practices fail to replenish the soil. It poisons the water with herbicides and chemicals. It increases erosion, so that you lose the topsoil. It uses fossil fuel to work it. It robs habitat of biodiversity. It creates dead zones in the oceans that surround us. Strips, even just 10% of the ground being in strips or corners, where you couldn't turn a 10-horse team, but you could turn a John Deere tractor. He suggests should be left, and we would suggest the same, so that you could have biodiversity. There are low-income areas, and if they're in prairie and in native prairie, like remnants of original prairie, then they look after themselves to a large extent. You don't have to work them and cost yourself money. The soil loss is reduced, the soil nutrient loss is reduced, It provides a home for pollinators. It increases the natural pest control because there are like 2,000 species of insects in the prairie, and they balance out with each other and control their own environment. And so a little piece of prairie kept afloat it controls itself. Contouring can help the ecology and prevent runoff. And he points out that there are 170 million acres of corn and soybean. And at the moment, they're experimenting with just 1,000 acres of corn and soybeans. You can get that article from a link which is www.nytimesnewyorktimes.com 2014 11/19, and there's more to it, but you'll get into it by doing that. http www.nytimes.com 11/19/14. There's a request for proposals going out by the University of Illinois, which is kind of interesting. It is presented by the Institute for Sustainability, Energy and Environment, and it has only been instituted by Chancellor Wise just 2 years ago. I think they have won funding already. The themes are climate, energy, infrastructure, water and land stewardship, agriculture, and last year's awards extended to $940,000 for 3 projects. What they're looking for is, one, group approach, although sometimes people who do research may be loners, so you don't want to class out individual people who have individual ideas. We look for group activity because many of us are involved with a multitude of different disciplines, but others settled on a little piece of the environment that they might know a lot about, and so we look for those sorts of people too. The sort of projects that were worked last year included a water disinfectant system, to some extent involving light, and that was to sterilize water that may have pathogens in it. And these sorts of grants are starter grants. So that is a starter for international interests, national interests, state, local interests. The second one was woody plants as a polyculture for agricultural alternatives. The fact that you can have shrubs and hedges and trees that yield perennially, so you don't have to harvest an annual crop and sow it each year and erode the soil each year. And so that project both those projects drew about $400,000, but it's really starter, because what the sustainability people are looking for is this international tie. They're being asked to create interest across campus and globally. And it's on that basis that the projects are selected. They're expected to go out and look at the granting money that they could get. So you're looking for a project that is not a one-time project. It's one that continues for many years. And that means you need people who have ability, people who have proven their capacity to do interesting things, and that gets a starter funding, and it's hoped that that will continue. A more individual one was the storage of energy for a stove in low-income areas. So those topics are the sort of things that we might look at locally. It's obvious that this funding is designed to go out into the community, and locally we're not professors or usually not within the university structure. We're outside it, but we have a lot of contact with university people, and this project was sent to me by Sam Smith, who was actually at Cranit, and he knows that we work with low-income communities from time to time. We had a Black History mural, for instance, for 30 years. We work with up to 8 counties and sometimes 15 counties. We look at regional planning, regional beyond one county. And he sent me this information because they were going to have and did hold a town meeting to alert people to this type of funding. And it's quite substantial. 940,000 last year, and the individual grants are still there. They're looking for young people too, people who are starting. One of the problems with university research is that if you have a young and interesting student, it almost takes 4 years to match that student's ability to a research grant, and by that time he's a senior or she's a senior, and they're ready to move on. So this program suggests that there may be some individual money for people who are young and trying to work out what they want to do, but what they want to do may be what sustainability wants to do too. And so to speed up the process of grantsmanship. And for us, we want to figure out how we might be able to fit into this with some of our activities that are more applied, but they also include research. There's one of our encounters this week was with the Department of Transportation, and that was in the area of Rantoul, where the Department of Transportation is working with experimental use of native grasses on the roadside. So if we're lucky, we'll show you some of that on film when we put this program up on television and on YouTube. So how do you interface that sort of research across departments, across colleges? How do you infuse art into agriculture? How do you think about interacting more broadly? And how do you interface with the community? Where are there overlaps? If you have a $35 million program to put fiber optics around town, how do you involve the North End community, which is not so affluent and is not necessarily doing a lot with computers? How can you upgrade that using university people from perhaps library science or those sorts of fields? How do people like WILL get information to people? How do we improve those resources so that they have a sustainability of their own? That means they go on into the future and they go internationally. We have roadsides. We have like Route 45. We have railroad beds, about 60 mile of abandoned railroad beds, 25 mile of which is being designated as a trail. So as you look at these things, don't give up because there's a university that's fairly structured and these are very formal proposals. Think about how you can approach a professor with interest, and it might be with fish or wildlife or reconstructions of prairies. It might be that you want to interact with the likes of Ameren, where they're putting in towers that leave the prairie underneath somewhat decimated. And how do we work with legal situations like when we have invasion of our railroad beds? How do you legally work with trying to preserve the biota that's on the railroad bed on either side of the what used to be the railroad bed? And we do have some people who have already dug that sort of land up and used it for agriculture and not compensated us. So there's a legal battle behind this. How do you maintain conservation areas? This week we've done a lot of seed picking because this is a very late fall, or a very early fall, I'm sorry, and so a lot of the seed is still on the plants, and we try to simulate that sort of planting by distributing seed that's related to the sites that we're working on, that might be on a cornfield, but might also be adjacent to a railroad right-of-way that has remnant prairies on it. If you want to dream, you might think about dreaming of a national park that would run down 45. We've looked at this a lot, but this is the sort of thing where you might think about how you might work with the university to create a unit, a research unit that might be sustainable for many years. There's an old Route 45 that runs down from Paxton to Rantoul and sort of continues on as a dual highway to Champaign-Urbana. that corridor is relatively intact, and it's the sort of corridor that's not exactly loaded, but it's very rich in prairie plants, and it could be encouraged. So how could we suggest that you take traffic off 57 at Kankakee and allow it to waddle down Highway 45, go past Kankakee. The Kankakee bottomlands are sandy as a result of glaciation. You had glacial rivers that when they dried up, the winds blew sand across the state. So there's almost sand dunes on the Kankakee River. So this is how do you introduce the rest of the country, the rest of the world, to your native vegetation. And then you get on the moraines and outwash plains that are also the part of this this terrain. And I'm thinking that you could leave things intact. You might want to establish a one-teacher school somewhere. You might want to introduce people to a wooden elevator, to a concrete elevator, to a steel elevator. You might want to introduce them to a railroad which had elevators about every 5 miles. Just using the existing landscape to interpret it. So you would have to have drives off, so for safety. You'd have to have trails, perhaps, to introduce people to certain sites. You would want to explain the agriculture. You would want to explain the use of water, the moraines, and you can do all of that without necessarily creating a national park. This would be using existing facilities. It might involve taking people to a facility if the people were willing. Like you could go to an elevator. A little of a problem because the elevators are prone to dust, and dust prone to fire, and sometimes that can be a problem. But many people have not been to see a elevator and find out how it works, and to be there perhaps at harvest time to see what harvest equipment is like. It's huge. It might be very costly. $300,000 for perhaps a combine harvester. How do you take the grain off the land with vehicles that have very large tires or cleat-tracks so that you can not compact the soil and create an erosion rill? How do you transport that on the roads? And then it raises questions, and that might be a little bit more difficult, but one of the questions is infrastructure, and that's part of what the sustainability people are looking at, infrastructure. If you put a semi-trailer load of grain on the road, it's going to impact the road perhaps as much as 500 cars running the same corridor. So do we improve the railroad infrastructure, preserve the railroad infrastructure? Perhaps that's worthwhile. So we're doing that from Urbana to Kickapoo State Park. We're preserving a railroad, and although we might be putting that into an interim trail right now, in the future we might be putting that into a railroad line that would go back to to Danville or go to Bloomington. And so at the state level, you might be thinking of a railroad line between Galesburg and Bloomington and Champaign-Urbana and Danville and perhaps on to Indianapolis. That's where you're starting to look at a research project which might be a starter project, but it might have connotations for another 100 years. So in their wisdom, the federal government has provided money for interim trail use. And there's that example there. So if you were bringing people from Chicago, instead of sending them down 57, which is a state highway, interstate, you would bring them closer to the landscape by putting them onto Route 45. There are gray fields that have been experimented with, like Rantools Grayfield is an airport, Air Force base that was retired. So how do you work with that? How do you perhaps have a retirement village for elderly people? How do you put a Lincoln challenge for wayward souls who need to be straightened out but not in prison? How do you teach them to do community work? How do you look at landfills that were used by the Air Force to restore the landfill to something near to natural when it, as a landfill, was kind of a EPA hazard zone? So there are a whole bunch of things that you could do on the way from Kankakee to Champaign-Urbana. And then you can get back onto Route 57, but you could also continue for 45 way down to Kinmundi, where there's very well-preserved railroad right-of-way prairies and other features like Rend Lake and Shelbyville and other places that are historic. And you have to understand that the glaciers brought rich soil to central Illinois, but as you get further south, you don't get quite as much opportunity for crops that make use of that rich soil that came from the Laurentian Shield in Canada. So southern Illinois, interestingly, has forests. So there's a Shawnee forest. And you could continue. The National Park Service does pretty well. They have a Natchez Trace that goes right down to New Orleans. And now they're having corridors that are east-west corridors that sort of parallel Route 80 or further south, Route 70, Route 40. So we have this sort of thing, but how to facilitate it and to look at it in the future and how to involve professors in looking at the ideas that are associated with this. For instance, if you're looking at a landscape, how do you examine the landscape? What elements are interesting to you and why? So there's a rural sociology associated with this. There's the little schools, the little towns that 60% of them were employees of the railroad or the elevator that coursed the town. There are drainage problems. There are how do we get water into the Mississippi and other places like that? How do we control the amount of runoff? And how perhaps do we change the attitude of people to the preservation, the sustainability of their own landscape? If you're going to work it only for corn and soybeans for hundreds of years, then we will lose some of the character of the biodiversity. We not only need those chemicals as specific chemicals, we need the plants that might provide future foods that we don't know about now. We want to look at climate changing and plants adapting to a different climate, whether it's climate that's created by a universe that is dynamic, or whether it's something that humans have an influence on. And gradually, as you get something like an internet and a huge computer that can do work that we cannot do in our own minds, we can put a mathematical models together that don't give us an answer, but they help us to understand what we're at. So these sustainability projects cross disciplines and include technicalities that help us understand. It might even be that we make a mistake, but we have to follow ideas. And if we make a mistake, that's a positive. That means that one doesn't work, something else might work. So how do we encourage that? At the moment, the climate has changed very quickly. And as a result, many of the crops that you eat are in danger of being frosted or frozen. So it has been a situation where people like Carrie, who have vegetables that come from their properties in southern Illinois to the local market, have to harvest the broccoli and the cauliflowers and the cucumbers and cucurbits generally before they freeze. This is called gleaning. And so there's a bunch of people who look at the waste of food that we have. Restaurants especially throw out a lot of viable food. How could that be reused? The most simplistic manner there is to convert that material into compost. So it becomes a fertilizer. But there are also situations where people don't eat everything that's on their plate. So can we teach people, through people like the Common Market, to eat just what they need and to select what they buy? But if they can only buy corn and soybeans, then that's sad. So what sort of structure do we create to give people alternatives? I went into Strawberry Fields, which is a local store that has provided a lot of alternatives, including, until fairly recently, the opportunity for people to go and chat and have coffee, and still provides that. But that feature is being lost to the community. It's closing in December for good, and we have to think about how do we involve people. I go to a supermarket and every apple is the same size. Everything on the shelf is so pristine that we're teaching people that neatness is godly, when actually that apple crop involved a lot of apples and a few bumps and pimples that we need to teach young people especially how to use those products. The apple that has a pimple on it can be used, and so can we encourage a supermarket to carry a more natural bell-shaped curve of the products that we produce naturally. And I would like to see that sort of agriculture continue. Instead of harvesting all your tomatoes on one day or all your peas in one day, to harvest them in a more broad spectrum, to perhaps have perennial plants, woody plants that would provide peaches, apples, plums, cherries, and shrubs that would provide edible material, but over a time period, which means we need equipment that would harvest, if we want to do it mechanically, to harvest over a long period of time rather than a short period of time, like one day when everything is at appropriate tenderness. Like peas, if you want to harvest peas, you have a tenderometer and you put your peas in these little bunch of needles, and when you push the needles down, the needles provide you with a measure, and so the pea plant can be harvested in full, and that's convenient, and it's also healthy that you get the right amount of sugar and the right amount of tenderness and flavor. But it is also cuts out the extremes, and sometimes the extremes are rather wonderful. It's like if you grow wine, if you're in France and you do it by hand, the extremes may be really marvelous, but you also have to know that there are things that don't work. So it's that bell-shaped curve. You're trying to utilize both ends. And I go to Kerry's at the farmer's market, and I always ask for those tomatoes or apples or peaches that can't be sold because the public has got used to being fed very neat materials and also very processed materials. So, but those tomatoes that have cracks in them or are bumbly are healthy foods for, not necessarily for distribution in the sense of having a food bank. It's hard to have a food bank, so that's another thing that you have to think about. How do you process this oddball material? How do you refrigerate so that the oddballs get to be useful? How do you distribute? And then we go back to the railroads and the roads that parallel them. How do we transport this material? If Southern Illinois, or Southern California for that matter, is a site for some of the multi-dimensional vegetables that we're talking about, pollinated by bees that we can want to encourage, how do we bring that to Chicago? That means we need some form of refrigeration. We need perhaps freight lines that are not stymied by people movers. As you think about these things, think about what you might dream, and then think about how you might find a professor who is interested. And this professor must probably have standing in his field, and so your interests should match. Somewhere in there's a potential PhD student, a potential postdoc, a potential undergraduate coming from high school, from the freshman. Can you think about a freshman looking at a prairie now and looking at a prairie when he's doing a PhD and a postdoc. What is the infrastructure around him, whether it be roads or railroads or waterways? How does he lock into a university structure which is often rather monolithic? Does he or she think about a particular thing that's of interest, or does he or she have to join a professor who has a huge lab and the ability to do things he could never or she could never do by themselves? So do you join an existing team? So this sustainability request for proposals is going out to people who are dreaming and people who might be very individualistic, but also groups that might do interesting things. Is there a political base to this? Yes, there is, because if you're going to move these thoughts, you probably need to have the skills of politicians to activate the thoughts and move the ideas. The person who is a renegade dreaming dreams is not necessarily the person who is going to activate the idea. So can you put together the rogue innovator who is dreaming with the regularity of a political structure that is more conservative? That conservative political structure can be stultifying if it gets into gridlock and doesn't go anywhere. How do we improve that situation and think about allowing people to dream? Does it involve people who are not degreed people? Perhaps it's people who have associate degrees like Parkland College. Perhaps it's people who only do one course. I'm very much thinking of doing one course in computer science because I'm very deficient in some aspects of taking this program and putting it into action. But we find that people are listening to this program, and since it goes up onto YouTube, people are being able to read it in other countries. And so we're thinking that in some ways we fit into this overall sustainability effort, which is angling to be continuous and to being worldwide, and to look at things like the oceans and the climate changes that go across borders. So I'm encouraging you out there to think about these things, to talk to people. Often just getting half a dozen of you together, you might even be only 3 together, and talking about these things to see how you can do this. Sometimes it means that you have to state what you have done in the past. Heartland Pathways has tended to put together ideas and innovate, but often Heartland Pathways areas has created groups like the Grand Prairie Friends or the Natural Areas Study Group, but we've been fairly careful to not look over the shoulder of those people so that they are encouraged to do their own thing. And they've done very well and been in action for 30 years. But at some point, we have to say that Greek Revival Cottage that is now the headquarters of the Banner Park District would not be there if we hadn't initiated the process. The Grand Prairie Friends has done all the things that we would have dreamed of them doing and more, but they weren't there at the outset. When I came from Australia many years ago, I could not find the prairie ecosystem until I did botany courses and eventually found out where the prairie existed. And at the moment, we're still losing that prairie at a rapid rate. So this week I had to talk to the administrators of Ameren. We talked last week about the hydroseeding of culverts that were used to move heavy equipment in to put in a pedestal and then a 100-foot tower. And those towers have to be restored. We've tried very hard to get species lists to know what species might be planted on our prairie where there's been some damage. How do we know if the seed has come from Oregon or Massachusetts or New Jersey or wherever? How do we know what will be planted on the roadside? We're on a site that we do not own. But let's face it, many of the sites that are conservation sites throughout the world are sites that aren't owned by the people who are concerned. Until there's enough power to move the idea, and sometimes the idea is kind of curious. It's like if this little lake is an interesting ecological site, then we'll get half for development of houses. You can get half for an ecological base. That doesn't sort of work. You're looking for something more than that. But often the people who are concerned are stewards. They're not the owners. So on South 45, the Department of Transportation owns most of the injured parts that we're restoring. Normally, they have been very helpful in signing this site as a prairie and planting on the roadside a mixture of prairie grasses down to the ditch, then up on the other side a mixture of mixed prairie mix, and then on the real prairie a more natural mix, and we've been allowed to add seed. And that hasn't exactly happened. We're told you don't own the land. Admitted, we don't own the land. But for several generations, this site has been cherished as a prairie. So how do we work with infrastructure people like Ameren and beg for an idea of where the seed comes from, how it will be planted, and what will be planted? So I did talk to Ameren, and I was a little disappointed that we still don't know where the seed came from. We still don't know what was planted, and that is going on around the world. So we're losing habitat at a rapid rate.
1 minute.
So time is almost up here. I think you get the message of what we're talking about. And if you have a chance to work with university personnel and with community personnel, and there's overlap here and there, and if you're a student who wants to participate in this, there's room for you, and there's room for retirees that have a little time to think and dream. So I'm encouraging you, and thanks for listening. Find us on YouTube. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.